Welcome to this webcast. My name is Axel Arden. We will be talking about recent developments in internationalization in higher education with Laura Rumbley. Laura Rumbley is Associate Director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. She is also co-editor of the Journal of Studies in International Education, and she's the chair of the Publications Committee of the European Association for International Education. Welcome, Laura. And this is going to be an interesting recording. We are in The Hague, December 2016, and we are looking forward to what you will tell us about recent developments in internationalization.
Thank you so much, Axel. It's a very great pleasure to be here. Den Haag is such an international city, and I find the Netherlands a very interesting country with respect to internationalization of higher education. A lot of different things being tested out in this environment, and so always a pleasure to come and discuss what recent things and new things are happening in this space. So thank you for having me. I wanted to structure this conversation in three basic ways today. The first would be to just give a little overview of the work that we do at the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. I always think it's impolite to presume that people know where I'm coming from with respect to a topic, and I like to give a sense of how it is that we approach this discussion about internationalization. I'd then like to dip into this main topic that we have for our agenda today, which is some thoughts about recent developments in internationalization of higher education, and then maybe to turn the focus a little toward the future and explore some ideas about some particular places that we might be headed with respect to internationalization. So just some food for thought for us to consider. Great. So the first topic to kind of run by you is this idea of what is the Boston College Center for International Higher Education. We've actually existed for about 21 years now, founded by a very prominent scholar of higher education by the name of Philip Altbach. And as you can see on the screen, we're really interested in exploring all different avenues and topics with regard to the topic of higher education from a comparative perspective. And we really have this core belief that an international perspective on the subject of higher education is really crucial at the end of the 20th century when we were founded, and now in the 21st century. There's so much to be gained by examining what we're doing around the world and learning from those perspectives and practices. So that's really the fundamental starting point for what we do at CIHE, as we're known. We are a US-based center, but we really do pride ourselves on having a very global perspective on what's happening in the world. And in addition to that fundamental value, we try to bring a variety of perspectives to the work that we do. So first and foremost, we're interested in bringing forward comparative perspectives, that there is no one way to approach a particular action or activity or part of higher education, and we need to explore the differences that we see across the landscape as well as the similarities. We're also interested in turning a critical eye on these questions, not simply describing them or swallowing them down as they appear at face value, but trying to dig under the surface and understand what's working, what's not working, what has the potential to do harm as well as good. So the critical dimension is something that we really try to keep also very front and center in the work that we do. Higher education, as you know, is an applied field, but we are very keen to bring serious academic perspectives, scholarly perspectives to the work that we do, to really get at the issues and ideas behind the practice. But the practice is also incredibly important, and those ideas don't mean anything unless we really kind of think about how they play out in the real world. So a balance of scholarly and practical perspectives is another area that we try to bring to the work that we do.
Can you give this some more concrete examples about what that means for you in practice?
Sure, and actually it feeds very nicely into some of the next things I'm going to talk about what we do, which is to say that in practice, our main kind of business, if you were, as a center, is to be involved in publications and projects. So we produce publications. We also are heavily involved in networking and collaboration, again, to bring that comparative perspective, and we're very involved in education and training. So for example, on the publications front, many viewers may be aware of our quarterly publication called International Higher Education. This is a publication that presents commentary and analysis from individuals in positions of knowledge with respect to policy and practice and ideas around higher education developments around the world. We also do academic books. So one of the images that you see on the screen here is our forthcoming book that looks at the phenomenon of international faculty mobility around the world. We examine the literature about mobility. What do we know in a scholarly sense about mobility? But then we also take a look at what specific countries, what specific institutions are doing in relation to the idea of faculty mobility, and what that phenomenon means for individuals who are themselves mobile as faculty. So we're trying to put these various dimensions into different publications that we do to try to shed light on the ideas that surround them, but also the practical applications. And the last example I can show on the screen here of a publication is a brief that we do in conjunction with the American Council on Education, and specifically their Center for Internationalization and Global Engagement. This brief series is really designed to provide leaders of higher education, mostly in the US context, but not exclusively, with information and ideas about developments in higher education that relate to internationalization and global engagement. So again, putting together ideas and concepts with practical situations and realities and considerations. In addition to our publications and projects, we are heavily networked, and this is both for the good reasons that we want to foster a great deal of contact and ideas across contexts, but we're also a very, very small center, and so there's no way that we alone could do what we feel is really important work about looking out across the global landscape. So an example here is that we have a very close relationship with the Higher School of Economics, the National Research University Higher School of Economics, and with them we've done a series of book projects over the last several years that try to provide a comparative perspective on some important issues in higher education. The experience of young faculty around the world, what's happening with the newest crop of faculty members moving into universities and other roles around the world. We've also examined the phenomenon of academic salaries and how those differ in different places, and what are the personal and policy implications of those kinds of things. And we're also part of a
Can I stop you there with the
Sure.
salaries? Because
Yeah.
if you look at internationalization, not everyone will understand what salaries have to do with internationalization.
Sure. So in the context of the specific study that we did, internationalization wasn't necessarily the heart of the matter. It was more an idea of trying to get a comparative picture around the world of what faculty earn, and whether or not faculty in different national contexts can have the expectation of being able to have a middle-class lifestyle in a role as a full-time faculty member. What becomes interesting about salaries, though, is the work that we do looking at faculty mobility around the world. And that there are, as we know, different push and pull factors that might motivate individual faculty members to be mobile, potentially in search of job security or a standard of living in a different context that they might not have in their original home country. So that might be a place where a salary discussion could have an impact on these matters of internationalization.
And the ranking of the quality of life, that's actually also
Absolutely.
tied into that discussion.
Absolutely, and also expectations for a career trajectory. As an ambitious young faculty member, one might look out across the global landscape and make some decisions, weigh some options about where could I position myself to really have access to the kinds of resources and funding and opportunities that I want for my career. Great. In addition to being networked and collaborating around the world, we're also very interested and involved in matters of education and training. We're part of a school of education at Boston College that for decades actually has offered programs at the doctoral level and at the master's level in the study of higher education. And very recently we've launched a new master's program specifically in international higher education. A very clear nod to the fact that international dimensions of higher education, internationalization being one very clear element of that, are becoming increasingly important. And particularly as younger individuals move into careers in higher education, it's becoming more and more crucial that they have an understanding of their place in the world, their institution's place in the world, how their particular national environment is engaging with a global context as well. We also are a landing place for visiting scholars from around the world who come and really feed into our discussions and also develop their own lines of research and publication and things like that. So it's a very dynamic and very, very interesting context in which we find ourselves. And what's become quite interesting, I think, is that the phenomenon, the specific phenomenon of internationalization has become much more central to the work that we are doing. And I think that's true in general. There's so much more going on in the realm of internationalization globally.
It's a global development to put this more in the center
Yes.
of all educational policy.
Absolutely.
So what has working at the center brought to you personally?
Well, I think personally it's given me a really very deep appreciation for the variety and complexity of higher education developments around the world. There are some fascinating similarities, of course, as well, in the way that academics think about their work and in the ways that universities might be structured and operating. But there are incredibly unique contextual differences. And I'm constantly reminded that it's crucial to keep that notion of context in mind, to be careful with the generalities that we make in an international or global context, because they're extremely susceptible to being disproven or that the contextual realities are extremely important because they really do really shape the realities of what's going on around the world.
It's the same issue with quality assurance. When we look at quality assurance, we always tell the experts and the peers that have to do the work to assess an institution or a program that they have to contextualize. They have to think from the position of the stakeholder that they're talking to. And if you're not able to actually think in the context of a higher education institution or a program that is being offered, you're not the right peer for that job. So that's when you look at internationalization and the issue that you now bring up, it's more or less the same issue.
Absolutely. So as we turn now to this discussion about recent developments in internationalization, I think that point that you've raised about context is extremely important. We operate in a very complex world. It's many different things. It's confusing, it's fragile, it's beautiful, it's small and increasingly smaller as we think about how accessible different parts of the world are to us in ways that they were not before. And in many ways it's also increasingly inscrutable, the surprises that we see as things happen around the world. So I think the complexity of our context is very important to keep in mind when we think about these recent developments in internationalization. And that everything that we talk about with regard to internationalization really does depend on your perspective. Where is it that you sit? In what particular national context, institutional context, etc. Many different variables to take into account. When I think about internationalization, though, I also think it's important to remind myself that not only is my unique perspective and the perspectives of others important, but we operate in a broader context. Internationalization isn't the only thing that's going on with higher education around the world. And in thinking about this conversation, it occurred to me that there are four different kind of, I think, trends or issues that I can point to that seem quite prominent to me on the global landscape. And the first has to do with this idea of growth and contraction. I think for many of us working in higher education, we have a sense that we're operating in a growth industry. There are growing numbers of students in many contexts, growing numbers of institutions, different kinds of institutions, different kinds of products and ways of delivering higher education that are emerging. And so, I think that sense of an expansion, if we're talking in big general global terms, is a real one. At the same time, although I am no economist, I'm told that there are these things called cycles when we think about phenomena such as growth. And we also see then contraction. We also see moments of stagnation. And as we look out across the global landscape, I think it is fair to say that there are some systems that are facing types of stagnation in what's happening in higher education, or even contraction. So that can be an aging population in certain contexts and smaller numbers of students, or different kinds of developments that are putting the brakes on this idea of growth. And that we need to be cognizant of whatever is happening in our context, but also the potential for cyclical change, and to be aware of what implications that might have for higher education more generally. I also think that it's very interesting to consider kind of a shifting landscape of depth and breadth when it comes to higher education. And there are a couple of different specific ways that I can talk about this. The first is that I think that there are a really fascinating array of new expectations for the role that higher education should be playing in societies around the world. Higher education institutions and systems are being put kind of front and center in discussions about economic growth and development, societal health and well-being, climate change matters, issues of public health, big, important issues in particular nations, but also on a global scale. That's a lot to put at the feet of higher education. And I also think the phenomenon of internationalization is really deeply implicated in those expectations as well. And so that's something to think about. Where are we headed with these expectations? And what is the extent to which internationalization is involved in that? And internationalization is penetrating really deeply into the fiber of what is happening within our higher education systems and institutions. So an issue that I think is worth keeping an eye on as well.
Do you see any correlation with what the role of the media is in like a society? And sometimes you see the critical voice of the media is retreating a bit. Does higher education actually have a role to play globally, internationally, when there has to be a critical voice about what happens in society at any moment anyway? Do you see this as a development in internationalization too then?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure if I see it, I'm not sure if I see that so clearly yet, but I think it's something certainly to watch for. In my own country, in the United States, there's a very kind of crucial public conversation going on today about the matter of credible information and knowledge about particular issues. What's making it into the public domain, who has the authority to speak with deep knowledge about particular issues, and who can be trusted. There's really kind of an issue of trust, I think, in the public conversation that's going on in the United States, and I'm imagining likely occurring in some other countries as well. So it will be very interesting moving forward to see the degree to which higher education can take up that challenge and position itself, or reposition, if it used to have that role, as a source of knowledge and information that the public really finds accessible as well. So I think it's not only the quality of what's being produced, but the perception that this is useful and is speaking to the audiences that it's trying to reach. So I think that's a very interesting area to watch over time. The other matter that I think is interesting on a global scale is this idea of diversity and isomorphism, and I'll explain that a little bit. In 1983, there was a very interesting and kind of seminal article that was written by two scholars, DiMaggio and Powell, in the United States, called The Iron Cage Revisited. It's the short title of a much longer, complicated title. And one of the key notions that they put forward in this article was this notion of isomorphism, which in very simple terms can be defined as the tendency for organizations to emulate one another. So if we look out across the landscape and we see institutions and organizations that seem to be doing things well, seem to be having some definable levels of success in some area, we find that a lot of other institutions start to gravitate in those directions. And that can be in relation to the way that institutions are structured, or the way that they go about their business in terms of systems, or what they teach, their curricula, things like that. And in the realm of internationalization, it's quite interesting to think about. I think we're all looking for some magic formula by which we are the most internationalized institution somehow, or we have the largest number of students that are mobile. the question for me becomes, when does that emulation and that search for good practice become a choice point between just following the pack or really innovating in some particularly unique ways that fit with one's reality and mission? So I think there are some risks and opportunities, and I think particularly in a context in which we have these very influential global rankings, a lot of people are moving in particular directions to fit a form that is somehow recognizable and deemed of high quality. And so things to be on the lookout for as we move forward as well, whether or not we're making the choice, all the choices for the right reasons in terms of the directions we follow.
Some national educational policies, they word this very positively as benchmarking, which is actually emulating some systems or ways of educational policy at institutional level, the development of organizations within higher education. But you can see benchmarking has a more positive connotation, while emulation, of course, means that you lose your own identity.
You know, exactly. I mean, I think that it is, as I mentioned at the very beginning, here I work for a center that is interested in scanning the environment and learning from one another. I think the crucial question then becomes, now that you've experienced that learning, what do you do with that? Is it to what extent are you taking up the models that others present and swallowing them down wholesale, or adapting them in particular ways? And I think that's, you know, a very individual question, institution to institution and system to system, about the extent to which, again, you go down these paths of emulation or try to strike out in a different direction with a sense that that particular path is better for us for a certain number of reasons. So I think all this is very interesting to think about moving forward. And finally, of crucial importance to the work that you do at NVAO is this idea of quality and accountability. And I don't think any one of us who works in higher education at the moment is any longer able to say that doing is sufficient, or saying that we're doing certain things is sufficient, but instead to really be able to document how it is that we are doing, what we are doing and why, and what is the impact of the work that we do. So enormous, I think, opportunities for really careful self-assessment of who we are and what we do and how do we know what the impact is of all of that. But I also think there are very real practical concerns in relation to this idea of even workloads associated with that. How much time do we put into this idea of accounting for what we're doing? How do you respond to all the different sources out there that are asking for that accountability? So I think this is, you know, just a part of university life, higher education life around the world that's crucially important, but also comes with some costs and some challenges in terms of getting right.
I remember when we had this discussion about quality and internationalization a few years ago in the Netherlands, that one of the questions that came up was, why are we doing this internationalization and what do you intend to achieve? And the whole outcome of the discussion eventually was that if you do not have any intended internationalization, that you know what you aim for, you can never be accountable for it, there will never be the quality that you desire of it. Now, how do you look at this in this global context and the intention behind internationalization and the development there?
So I think that in many different places around the world, the intention of internationalization has been to internationalize. That there has not been this broader understanding that internationalization, in my opinion, is a vehicle towards something else. And that something else ideally being higher quality of education, of service to society, of research and knowledge that we develop. So I think it's a common challenge that we are being led down a path, or leading ourselves down a path, without a really clear sense of what is the end goal, what is it that we're really trying to work toward. We're turning the goals, we're getting caught up in the goals without really understanding the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve. I think that's a very common challenge around the world. So to put this kind of in a bigger picture, to summarize for just a moment, I think we really, in the field of higher education, find ourselves in a place where there is a world of complexity, of disruption, of inequality, and frankly, of danger. There are bad things that can happen, and we really need to be alert to the fact that we work in a very complex and difficult environment. It is not always dangerous and difficult, but that's always part of the panorama, and I think that's a very important kind of grounding notion to have as well, as we think about internationalization specifically. And wanting to turn to that question.
Can I ask you a question about these challenges? Because I think these challenges are global. These are global challenges. But how are they evolving in the different regions? Because when I look at the developments globally, I see regions that they are developing and are jointly developing certain aspects of educational policy with regional qualification frameworks, regional frameworks for quality assurance. So you have this joint development regionally. Does that also have an impact on how these regional perspectives are developing when it comes to these challenges?
So I do think that it is important to think about the ways that different regions around the world, where they kind of find themselves on a continuum of engagement with internationalization, with understanding of it, with commitment to it. And also the fact that, in my experience, there are many regions of the world that are not terribly interested in looking within their own region, but are constantly looking outside of their region as well. And I find that understandable on some level, but also I think that's an area of great opportunity for regions around the world to think a bit more about their own region and how it is that they can work and strengthen within that particular context. For me, the classic example of that is Latin America, which I find particularly interesting because of a largely shared language, two major languages certainly, but many, many challenges to engage with one another, to kind of make that commitment, to think about internationalization in that particular context, and in what ways that could be, they could operate from a position of strength if they were to think regionally about what they might achieve. We have a colleague by the name of Damto Tefera, who's working at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And he recently has launched a very interesting initiative called HEFALA. This is the acronym, the Higher Education Forum for Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And really trying to foster a conversation across those major world regions to think about what is it that we have in common? What are some of the ways that we can talk to one another and be involved in looking at what we're doing in these regions, and step away a bit from the European, the North American, the Australian models, to consider how we're different and what we can bring to this conversation about higher education. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in that conversation about regionalization.
Interesting.
So to think for a moment about, to bring it down a step, we have these global concerns and different issues that are going on, and now to think a little bit more specifically about internationalization itself. And I thought for the purposes of this discussion, it might be nice to divide that conversation up into kind of two broad categories. The first would be the realm of ideas and theories and concepts, kind of what's new or what's brewing in that area. And then the other would be in this area of policy and practice, kind of in practical, real-world terms. What are some of the things we might be seeing that give us a sense of new developments? So on the theory and concept side, there were three thoughts that occurred to me as I was kind of preparing for our conversation. One of these issues is whether or not theory is playing the role that it should in the work that we do with internationalization. Also, I think it's important to kind of check in on this idea of an evolving definition for internationalization. And I also think we ought to consider what's on the horizon in terms of possible new ways of thinking about and understanding internationalization. So to give you a sense of where I'm coming from with those thoughts, it occurred to me that at a recent national conference in the United States, the Association for Study of Higher Education, which is the scholarly organization for higher education in the US, there was a very interesting spontaneous discussion that came up in a session that I happened to be attending. And the conversation happened to involve two very, very respected colleagues in our field, Anna Kosmutsky of INSHIR in Kassel and Imanol Ordorica of the UNAM in Mexico. And I'm absolutely paraphrasing, just kind of reporting out my experience of this conversation, which is on the one hand, Anna Kosmutsky saying that she had a real concern that in our field, we are not, there is not enough theory, that we're talking all the time in these very practical, applied terms, and we are really shortchanging the opportunity to frame those realities in a theoretical framework that could help us make deeper and better meaning out of what's happening. Imanol responded and said, from my perspective at the moment, I feel like there's too much theory, or we're spending too much time in this realm of ideas, and we're not doing a good enough job translating that into better practice in very, very paraphrased terms. What was interesting to me about this conversation is that it happened the day after the US presidential election in November. And I think in the context of our meeting at ASH, we had a lot of concerns about the ways in which what we feel are the positive contributions that higher education can make to social discussions, to policy making. Those contributions are not finding their way effectively into the real world. And I think there's a very interesting conversation to be had there about how do you balance those two very important and interesting parts of the puzzle. What's the best way forward? And I think that's going to be an important conversation as internationalization becomes, as a field of study, ever more complex and deeply explored. That's great. But also on the policy and practice side, then how is all of that work going to inform what we do in practical terms?
You could say that globalization is challenged in the public domain. The aftermath of the elections in the United States, Brexit. We have a discussion here also in the European continent about where are we going with globalization and what is the benefit. Internationalization of higher education sometimes feels forced with national policies that try to enforce certain elements of internationalization on the higher education sector. What would you say is the best way for the higher education community as a whole to address these concerns about globalization and internationalization?
Well, it definitely gets into something that I'm going to touch on toward the end of our conversation, but in kind of simple terms, I think the idea, a crucial idea moving forward, is that there is much better communication and facilitation between the various major stakeholders that are involved and should be involved in this conversation. So we have, I think, a community of people who work in internationalization who are convinced of the value and the positive contribution that internationalization can make in our world. Those convictions need to be properly grounded in data and evidence that is actually the case. And then that data and evidence needs to be packaged in particular ways that stakeholders in our societies, in our communities, can consume and really buy into and feel connected to somehow. So there's a really interesting chain of actors and chain of actions that I think needs to take place in which we're all implicated. But better communication and and that communication needs to go both ways. I think those of us who work in scholarship of higher education and internationalization also need to be listening very clearly to our communities and our society and hearing the concerns or fears or aspirations that exist there, and how do we then pull that into our own research and understand what is internationalization and what can it do in terms of good service to the societies in which we operate.
Interesting.
Yeah, a lot of work ahead in that area, I would say. So the second idea in this space about theory and ideas is this issue of an evolving definition. And I simply want to say that internationalization is still in the act of being defined. I think it's still a question that's up in the air about what exactly is internationalization. And we've had a lot of work on this effort to define. A seminal definition appears on the screen here of Jane Knight from 2003, which many of us are very, very familiar with. More recently, in 2015, we have a definition that's been put forward by Hans de Wit and Fiona Hunter and some colleagues working in the context of a report for the European Parliament on internationalization, what it is and what it's doing in the world. And I think it's very interesting in this new definition, which builds very openly and overtly on Jane Knight's original definition, is that internationalization should be understood as an intentional act, not something that just happens on its own. And that at the heart of it, there is a normative something that says we should be doing this in an effort to enhance quality and in an effort to serve all of our stakeholders and make a positive contribution to society. So I think whether or not one buys into this definition, what I think it illustrates is that there is an ongoing conversation about this very question. What is internationalization? What should it be good for? And I think we'll see a lot more discussion of that over time and refining. I also think that there are these contextual matters that we talked about before, and different stakeholders in different places around the world are going to have to examine these definitions and decide the extent to which they speak for them, or whether or not there should be distinctions for different settings.
Do you feel that there seems to be a more coherent agreement on these definitions now, where these definitions used to be contradicted or even just put aside, and now whenever you read about internationalization, well, Jane Knight definition is more or less central to everything everyone ever talks about in internationalization. So do you have an idea that we are now able to define internationalization better? Does that lead to a better way of approaching the theory of internationalization?
Those are excellent questions. I feel like there was a moment in the evolution of our thinking about internationalization when working on the definition was really important. There were lots of different people who were nibbling at the edges of this idea of defining internationalization. And Jane Knight seemed to hit on something that was flexible enough and open enough that and covered major ground in terms of the areas that it touches upon, that I think a lot of people felt very, very comfortable saying, we can work with this starting point. As we move forward now, I tend to think, and particularly with this new definition out of 2015, which I think has provoked a lot of conversation, I think we may see a return to this idea of trying to figure out, does this really speak for us? And does our research bear out, confidence and comfort with this new definition? So I think it was important to see something taking Jane's definition and moving it in a slightly different direction to give us some fodder for new conversations around what internationalization is. And I think particularly the quality question is really crucial, because as we have already said, doing is one thing, but doing things well according to some definition becomes increasingly high stakes.
At MVO, we feel we contributed tremendously to this definition. All the work we did with Hans on the quality and internationalization. When this definition came out, we felt a bit ownership.
Very nice. It's lovely to see your own work, filtering through
absolutely.
An important system of discussion about what's going on. So, very well done on this one. Also in thinking about definitions and sort of the body of knowledge that we have about internationalization, I think we can expect to see some kind of some new efforts to get a deeper and different understanding of what internationalization is. And some very simple ideas for us to consider would be this idea of data, and specifically big or bigger data, large data sets, even the biggest data. So we, particularly in the contemporary era, if we look at nothing else than mobility, we have big numbers in regions, in particular regions of the world, Europe being a standout in that regard, but also globally, we start to see big numbers, and there now may be some things that we can do with those bigger numbers in terms of analyzing them, crunching them in different ways, and trying to make some new and different sense out of them. Of course, we all know there are great concerns about the quality of the data that we have and the comparability of data, but I think there are some interesting new efforts that are being undertaken to kind of get at elements of internationalization in a quantitative way that I think is
also
exciting.
the work on the standard definitions, which is also important to
Yes.
make things comparable.
Absolutely, yeah. Figuring out how do we get data that we can use in different contexts. I know the Erasmus Impact Study is an example of that, and I also think organizations are like iGraduate, who have been surveying large numbers of students. What might they be able to tell us over time with these large bodies of data? So I think that's an interesting area to watch for the future. I also think, I know we've been wringing our hands over this question for a long time, but so much of the scholarship on internationalization is coming out of an Anglo, Northern European, Australian context. Not only what's been written about, but who's doing the writing, where the research is being published and presented and things like that. So I very much think that there is a general consensus that it is a bigger world, and there are different perspectives out there on what is happening with internationalization. And I tend to be a person for whom the glass is half full, and I anticipate and hope that we will be seeing in the scholarship more attention paid to non-Western perspectives and paradigms that hopefully will give us some new insights into what internationalization means in different places around the world. And just the final thing I wanted to reiterate is this idea of critical perspectives. Again, I think the tradition in internationalization has been to approach it with a starting point that somehow it is a good. And I think there should be, and are, but should be more conversations that really unpack the complexities and the potential risks, the damage that can be done by internationalization or internationalization poorly done. And I think we need to have a more objective eye on what it is that's happening and what the impact is of that for individuals, for institutions, for communities, for nations and regions.
This is the second time that you actually refer to the potential downside of internationalization. You introduced this in the beginning as aspects that harm, when you talked about the center, and now I think can you give us an example of what you have found of, well, maybe not the downside, but elements that do not achieve the good of internationalization?
So the classic example, of course, is this phenomenon of brain drain, that there are societies that in the equation of who wins and loses by virtue of international mobility, whether it be students or scholars, there are some countries that end up on the losing end of that game because talent that A, they may have originally educated, or B, that they were relying on to feed back into different aspects of society has gotten up and gone elsewhere to the benefit of another system or another country. So that's kind of the classic example. But an interesting example that comes out of some of the research that we've done just recently about faculty mobility is a little smaller scale in terms of its stakes, but I find quite interesting. We have examples of countries and institutions in our book on international faculty mobility where international faculty have been recruited, and these are individuals, in the context of our book, we're talking about faculty mobility that is not a short-term visiting scholar, visiting faculty kind of experience, but rather somebody being hired in a more permanent way from one context to another, a non-local context, to become a faculty member there. And some institutions that have done this in a way that really gives those incoming international faculty some very unique privileges in the context of their job at the host institution. So maybe higher salaries than locally hired faculty members, or somehow preferential working conditions, whereby the international faculty member maybe doesn't have to teach quite as many courses and is given more time for research and publication and that kind of thing. And in some of those contexts, there have been some unhappy dynamics that have developed between the two sets of faculty, domestic and international, where the original idea was that the importing of this talent was going to be beneficial and exciting and dynamic for the host institution. We see some downsides, unhappiness on both sides. And there can also be situations where expectations of these incoming international faculty are not met. And then that can sow the seeds for difficulty moving forward, for internationalization generally, for new faculty mobility in the future. So I think there are elements like that that are kind of form part of that picture.
It's not just a downside, it can actually undermine internationalization.
Yes, very much so. So that's a risk. Yeah.
Interesting.
So moving on from this idea, or this consideration of ideas, I wanted to touch very briefly on some thoughts about recent developments or areas to watch for the future in regard to policy and practice. And obviously there are many, many things that we could have talked about, and these are just a couple that have caught my attention recently. The first is this idea of faster, higher, stronger. This phrase is actually the motto of the Olympics. And it is known to me because recently the center was involved in the publication of a book about the experiences of universities around the world with global rankings. And this idea of upward, onward, better, faster, higher, all things kind of moving forward in a rush. And I think when we were talking about this idea of growth in higher education generally, this idea of constant expansion, a constant call for higher quality, I think this puts a lot of pressure on internationalization as something that constantly has to expand, to be bigger, to be brighter, to be more exciting in different ways. Just as with the phenomenon of rankings, I'm not opposed to the idea of bigger, better, brighter, but I also think it needs to be a thoughtful decision about growth and expansion. And I worry sometimes that we're on this train that says that it's the only way forward is to do more. We need more internationally mobile students. We need more curricula that are internationally oriented or have dimensions that are comparative in nature. That might be okay, again, if it's thoughtfully explored. So a blind, forward impulse is worrisome to me. And I think we see, as you had mentioned earlier, some national policies and things that set out these big goals that seem to be in some ways kind of plucked from the air. They sound wonderful, and it's hard to think, well, why wouldn't that be a good thing? Until you start getting into the realities of implementation and, what are we doing here and why?
Sound bites without any.
Exactly. Yeah, it all sounds good, but what's it really all about? And so I think that becomes quite crucial. We also, I think, are around the world in quite a fascinating way becoming much more attuned to the concerns about what we might call the non-mobile majority. Vast majority of faculty and students are not mobile. They remain in their own countries, they're educated there, and yet they're living in a highly globalized environment. So turning that attention to that non-mobile majority and the way that group needs to be served by higher education by way of internationalization, I think is a very interesting new development and an extremely important one to watch for the future.
That's interesting. We used to call that internationalization at home for me, being on the outside of this, I've seen this developing into the discussion about internationalizing the curriculum, which is a more coherent way of looking at non-mobile students or just higher education as a whole. How do you see this as a development in internationalization, this discussion, internationalization at home, internationalizing the curriculum? Is there a next step that we can expect?
I wish I had an answer, a pithy response to say, yes, this is the next step. I do feel that the conversations that have been going on around internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum have been extremely constructive and interesting and important. I have enjoyed hearing the debate about what encompasses what. So is internationalization at home a part of internationalizing the curriculum, or is internationalization of the curriculum a subset of internationalization at home? My understanding is that key players in that debate have decided that internationalization of the curriculum is actually the more overarching phenomenon, because no matter whether you are at home or abroad or out in space somewhere, if you are connected to a higher education institution, particularly as a student, you are going to be touched by the curriculum no matter what. So the curriculum, it should touch every single student within an institution. So if internationalization filters into the curriculum in meaningful ways, it will ideally, in some way, touch every student. So I think the frontier, there is so much work to be done with the phenomenon of both internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum. I think that's going to keep us busy for some time, because there is so much to be done in those areas. So I'm not sure what that next iteration will be. It might be a little while before we find our way there, given all that needs to happen in those other two spaces.
There will be a development. I'm quite sure that there will be something next.
Exactly. Hopefully you and I will work on that, and we'll be known for that next development. And finally, as you know very well here at NBAO, this idea of how we gather and make sense of evidence of impact is vital. And really, again, we all know it needs to be done. There are lots of different efforts that are being tested out to do that, as you know much better than I. But an immense amount of work to be done around the world. And I think we can see different pockets of places where maybe more work has been done, there's been more history with it, and other places where this concept is quite new, and really the systems are not quite in place yet to get very far with that. But I think that's a hugely interesting and important frontier issue too, that we'll be seeing more of. And NVA will be very involved.
Substantiated internationalization.
Yes, exactly.
Not just a flag, but a box with something in it.
Exactly, yes, clearly understood. Great. So beyond those two, I think really important areas that we'll be watching, there were just a couple of other thoughts and ideas that I wanted to leave with you with respect to this idea of where are we headed with internationalization and where could we be headed. And the first notion that came to me to share with you is an idea that I have been cooking up for the last year or so, that I'm putting under this umbrella term of intelligent internationalization.
Sounds good.
Alliteration is always appreciated. And what this essentially entails is a gathering together, a very thoughtful and purposeful intersection of four key communities that have something to do, very important to do with internationalization. The practitioners who are involved kind of on the front line of internationalization design and delivery, the policymakers who clearly want something out of higher education and see internationalization as an avenue, the researchers who are trying to make sense of the inputs and outputs of all of this, and of course the leadership that provides the framework in which we work, often in conjunction with policymakers, the funding that makes certain things happen. And I think the confluence of these four different communities, if intelligently managed, could really yield some important new dimensions and new prospects for internationalization.
Before we dig into this a bit deeper, you seem to have squared internationalization. Where did you get this idea? What are the origins of the idea for you, and how has this changed the way you now approach internationalization?
So the idea came from a seminar that my center helped organize with support from SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency, a couple of years ago. So we organized a seminar in 2013 in Shanghai. And the idea was to convene a relatively unheard of meeting that would involve the directors of research centers focused on higher education from around the world. So these research centers that exist around the world that study higher education, a lot of them kind of know of one another, but rarely do you gather in one room the directors of, let's say, a good 20 to 25 of these centers from different regions and countries around the world. And the main interest of the meeting was to have a conversation around the intersection between research about higher education and policymaking around higher education. And it was really a very fascinating experience to hear the conversation around this very large table, and to have a very clear sense that this is a very troubled, unsatisfying relationship for a lot of the actors involved. On the policymaking side, there's a sense that what comes out of higher education research often doesn't speak the language of policy and is not always clear about what the policy implications could be.
Transferability.
Exactly. And on the research side, a very keen sense that policymakers are either unwilling or unable to take the reality that's offered by research and use it in meaningful ways in terms of policy making.
Research-informed policy making.
Exactly. And I mean, that's a gross generalization of the two sides of that conversation.
I think we have that here too.
But I think it's a very legitimate challenge that we face all over the world. And a couple of years later, I was asked to write a very small piece for the 20th anniversary edition of our quarterly publication, International Higher Education at Boston College, about something that there were a number of invited authors to contribute a short piece on what do you think is one of the most important issues for the next 20 years in higher education. And because I'm so committed to the field of internationalization, I got to thinking about, well, for me, it's that synergy of these key stakeholders. How are they going to come together? Because we really need to see all of these groups represented in effective internationalization, policy, practice, research, and reality. So that's where this idea came from for me. And I think maybe the most concrete way that it's affected kind of the way that I go about my work and the way that I think about internationalization is in the context of this new master's program in international higher education that we do now at Boston College. And I'm constantly working to try and help my master's students situate themselves in this landscape. No matter what direction they end up working in the field of international higher education, I so want them to be sensitized to the fact that they are not alone on that landscape, that there are these other key actors, and that to really think in very savvy and very sustainable and very innovative ways about where we can go with this phenomenon. All of these different sectors need to be part of the equation. So that's really helping me, I think, orient my approach to what I hope I can transmit to the students that we have in that program. So to give you just a simple couple of ideas about kind of what anchors this idea of intelligent internationalization is essentially this idea that we would ground ourselves in a body of knowledge that encompasses both theory and practice. with the idea of really trying to improve our understanding of what's going on with respect to internationalization, both locally and globally. So these various dimensions, again, that can be brought together almost like in a matrix, of making sure we take account of all of those different elements in order to really understand what's going on and where we might be headed. As I've said, I'm personally quite committed to this idea of training practitioners. And I think that intelligent internationalization needs to have at its disposal kind of an army of practitioners who are very well trained and have access to all these different kind of layers of ideas and understanding in order to be able to carry forward the work of internationalization. So I'm not saying necessarily that practitioners are the privileged group in this area, but I think that practitioners are a really compelling group to have involved in this conversation because of the very key role that they play in implementation. So that training needs to be improved kind of everywhere. And finally, we need to have a real commitment to sustaining a community and avenues of communication between these various stakeholders, so that it's not a once in a while kind of thing or an afterthought that we can connect and communicate with one another, but that it really is a thoughtful intersection, a very future-oriented kind of connection that we have and a conversation that we have among all of these stakeholders. So these are kind of the grounding elements. And finally...
Have you any idea of how you can organize such an intersection?
So I'll give an example of something that's emerged kind of in this space in the United States. A colleague of mine, Robin Helms, at the American Council on Education, a year or so ago, were involved in a project to try to map out the landscape of national policies for internationalization. And she subsequently wrote, after we did that work, she wrote a report that really tried to assess the US national situation with a policy for internationalization. We don't have a national level ministry of higher education. Higher education is a very decentralized phenomenon in the US. So what do we do in a context like that where a national vision for internationalization is complicated to achieve because we have this immense decentralization? And one of the conclusions that she came to was that we really need to have structures, mechanisms, opportunities for key stakeholders that have funding, that have interests, that have implementers and practitioners in communication with one another. And fora of different kinds that allow those conversations to happen on a regular basis and on a substantive basis. So we have a lot of wonderful conferences, for example, that bring together different members of these communities, but it's not in a systematic way that we say, we'd like to advance this conversation regularly with a particular kind of agenda. It's sort of whoever gets accepted to a conference, in a given year, or whoever happens to be invited as a speaker. So it's a little ad hoc. And one of her suggestions was really to put together, a standing working group, potentially, that would regularly have representatives from key organizations to help keep this conversation moving. So that was not written with a specific eye to this idea of intelligent internationalization, but that kind of a mechanism, to me sounds like a very interesting way to move forward. And in that spirit, these ideas of how we would proceed, information is clearly needed. So we do need to have good sources of information about what's happening with internationalization. We need communication, we need a facilitation effort that goes on so that we're not kind of left to our own devices, but that there is some guidance about, let's try and move the conversation forward in this particular way. I think we need incentives for those kinds of engagements because we're all very busy people and we need to figure out what's in it for us. And certainly we need time, and that's always the precious, precious commodity.
What is it? What is in it for the policymakers?
That's an excellent question. You know, if policymakers are concerned with quality and competitiveness of a system of higher education, and internationalization is deemed to be an important ingredient in that recipe, I think being connected to those other stakeholders hopefully will give them the material that they need to craft successful policies. I think the policy area is one of the most challenging for me personally, in the sense that, if nothing else, there seems to be a lot of turnover of policymakers. So we have new governments coming in, we have new individuals that take up roles when those changes happen. And I think that often there's a lot of excitement at the start. Let's get our new policy out there and going, but then not nearly as much attention to the evaluation of that policy or seeing it through to something concrete, which is not a criticism so much as just a political reality. And I think that makes it very challenging to really work with that part of the puzzle.
It's the actor that changes the most, so it's the most difficult to engage and have a continuous conversation with them.
Yes, and also so crucial because so much of the funding typically moves through the policy sphere.
True.
So we cannot go without them, but it is a challenging group, I think. I will leave you with one last thought at the end of this long conversation. I am really excited about the idea of our next generation of practitioners and researchers and policymakers and leaders with respect to internationalization. I think there has been an incredible first generation of individuals who opened the door on this field of internationalization, who presented us with really seminal definitions, got us all very excited and engaged with this idea of what internationalization is and could offer. And I think we now need to kind of open that door wider to a new generation of thinkers and actors with respect to this phenomenon. And one example of kind of giving voice to that new group is a book that a colleague of mine and I are co-editing and hope will see the light of day sometime in 2017 or early 2018. That is this future agenda for internationalization. And we have specifically put a call out to very early career individuals, researchers and practitioners who would like to put forward some new ideas about what internationalization may be and where it's headed, across different contexts potentially, different ways of studying and understanding and analyzing, and then just generally new kinds of topics for thinking about internationalization. So we're hoping that will yield some interesting new ideas for us all to consider.
Can you give us like a small taste of what these insights are?
Sure. So a couple that strike me are an individual who's doing research that attempts to use a data mining software application to analyze national policies for internationalization from around the world. So she has taken tens and tens of national policies for internationalization, fed them through this data mining software, and is spitting out on the other end some mapping, visual graphics of terms and ideas that are present in these national policies. And I think that's an extremely interesting way to kind of think about what are national policies around the world aiming for, what are they talking about, how are they talking about them. So that's one example, I think, of a very interesting new mode for researching internationalization. We also have another individual who is an early career researcher in higher education, who's been looking at the way that graduate students who are studying international and comparative higher education are being prepared or not for international field work in their research. So how are we training young scholars?
Are we training?
Exactly. to go out into the world and do some of this crucial research that we think is so important. So it's kind of a meta examination of what we're doing in our own preparation of researchers in our field.
But it has very practical applications.
Exactly, absolutely. And I love seeing that connection between the practical and the scholarly as well. So I think there will be some very interesting ideas that come out of this publication.
And so when is this publication?
It's due out in late 2017.
Okay.
Yes. So we'll be advising you as this comes down the pike.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you for your time. I hope that these ideas provide some interest, and it'll be very exciting to see where a lot of these conversations are going in the coming months and years.
Thank you. Is there anything that you thought of during your talk that you did not mention but that you would like to end with?
I wish that I had something extremely pithy to say, only that, I think I wake up every morning extremely engaged and interested in internationalization. I think it's a topic that has incredibly fascinating and multi-dimensional elements to it that are continuing to give and to grow, and that this is an area that we'll be spending a lot of time looking at well into the future, and I remain very excited about what lies ahead.
That's a very nice way of ending this conversation. Thank you, Laura, for giving us all these insights in the recent developments in internationalization. Thank you, the watcher, for being there in this conversation. And we end here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.